I know that measurement and or more precisely evaluation in your preferred term, is a big issue. Can we cut to the chase and can you explain how much better off HR directors are going to be if they invest time and effort into evaluating their contribution to the organisation?
Sure. Probably the best people, actually, the HR directors who use some of our stuff on the phone, they can probably tell you. I think the measurement and evaluation, the key bit is it puts things in place which aren't there before. Measurement by itself doesn't do anything, but by measuring you start to understand what it is you're dealing with. HR directors and HR function, if not the organisation, are always faced with trying to evaluate things in people management terms. The problem is quite often we've come from a base which hasn't used measurement at all, and therefore people tend to scratch around. They may implement things but actually really don't know if any difference is made. And one of the big problems for HR functions is actually their value proposition on the back of this. What are we actually doing that makes a difference over time? So a key point really on measurement evaluation is by using some of the tools and methodologies we propose, and there are others, a HR function can really get what its value proposition is to the organisation. The organisation can understand why HR is important. And more fundamentally, the whole point about all things regarding HR and human capital management terms is around performance of the organisation. And the measurement evaluation gives people some of the answers to that. Classic case in point is a lot of leadership development is done, lots of money is spent, but quite often you find out nobody really knows if it made a great deal of difference. And one would think with the amount of money spent, you'd like to have a little bit more insight. Measurement evaluation is just a classic way of being able to do that in the way which we describe.
Is part of the problem, though, this difficulty in evaluating the contribution? Because sometimes, taking leadership development, this is over a long time span and there isn't a quick return, whereas cutting costs or so on can produce very instant.
Yes, I mean, the measurement spectrum, obviously you can measure things quite shortly. The leadership development example is one classically that, yes, you may take 12 months to deliver, 18 months, 24 months, 3 years to realise. The point we make is if you've got no measurement or a base of evaluation in the first place, you don't know what problem you're trying to solve. The measurement techniques you can put in and look and evaluate over a period of time to see any changes. It's multifaceted in the fact that you're not always looking at one thing either. Leadership involves invariably a number of things, and by looking at it in this way, you're able to do factor analysis and other techniques to be able to decide what has actually changed. Linking it to things like employee engagement, which is a lot of work that goes on. Again, how has leadership development maybe impacted on employee engagement over the last several years? If you've not been measuring engagement, you can't answer the question. And I think that's the fundamental, that even over long periods you can still measure in shorter time factors and look at the classic what's called time series and see what difference it's made.
And do companies or organisations in the public sector who haven't traditionally been evaluating and measuring their contribution to the business, have they found it difficult to put in place the systems, gather the data and so on? Is that a major exercise for any organisation at the start?
It's for every organisation it's a bit different depending on the legacy of where they're at in the process of ready-made data or measurement techniques. To come to the point of the public sector, actually we've found, particularly with the NHS where we've been doing quite a bit of work, there's actually a lot of focus and actually quite a bit of expertise and understanding what measurement is about. And quite often we're able to effect some material changes quite quickly given the sizes of some of the trusts, for example. And there's been quite a bit of take-up on measurement in the NHS. It's been good to see because quite honestly there's been a long time in terms of serving patients, but actually there's never been any evaluation on how well the people management side of hospitals, which is extremely important. And so measurement actually has been taken up, from we see, on engagement and other factors of management quite well in the NHS, contrary to perhaps what people think.
Overall, do you have a sense of how sophisticated or unsophisticated British industry is in terms of evaluating HR's performance contribution?
Yes, we've done this series of research over time. UK is probably no better or worse than for example, in comparison to the States. However, we do find that there's been some interest coming from the Asian countries, in particular India, whereby they seem to have cut out a little bit on the curve and realised that engagement and measurement is part of what they should be doing. And my feeling is over the next decade we might see quite a lot of the Asian companies actually get up to speed, as we call it, where perhaps many in this country still are only at. And there's definitely a curve, as we call it, in terms of the maturity of what organisations are doing. And we tend to deal with those that are across the curve.
And what are the characteristics of companies that do follow this route? Are there any particular patterns? I mean, would you be able to perhaps predict that this is the kind of company that's likely to take up evaluation and measurement? Are there features about the HR function that give you clues to
It's
this?
yes and no at times. There are some common features. It normally will require the fact that possibly the CEO and senior management team have a bending towards understanding why engagement is important, as opposed to not. Certainly, I think at senior HR level, that is a material factor. Those clients that we deal with, you know that the HR director does at least understand the importance. I couldn't put my hand on heart and say that's for all HR directors. But in terms of organisations, it's actually quite interesting. It's across the piece, and sometimes it's quite surprising which organisations actually do this. It may surprise a few people.
Your human capital management model is pretty comprehensive. Would you suggest that people start with a particular slice of that model and then build up from there, or how would a company embed measurement, evaluation into their work?
Again, the answer is yes and no. Depending on where the organisation is or the HR function is, we can start at a base level, maybe a simple looking at what metrics are measured and why, or we can look at a particular intervention that people want to move up and do a particular corporate scorecard that starts to ask some questions around what should be measured. Or it can be a specific intervention because employee engagement or management factors around that need to be improved, and that's another entry. What's interesting in measurement, which is why we like the work so much, is there are many entry points. And people should never be put off thinking it's too big to chew. There's always a place to start, and there's always a place to down tools almost. It's never a start and finish. It is a journey, to use that old cliche, that people start on it and will just move on. I think it's important for people to recognise that fact.
And has the interest over the past decade or so in measurement frameworks like the balanced scorecard, has this been a factor in the growing interest in measurement?
Yes, in one way, that people have seen the fact that measurement can add value. I'll be specific. Some measurement can detract if it's not done properly. And I think the thing with balanced scorecard is it does have its detractors, because and it's not because of the model or the concept of Kaplan and Norton, but the fact that actually quite often you find it's poor implementation. And we do come across sometimes, we see people who've started on a measurement exercise who've used internal resource and not used external expertise and have gone down cul-de-sacs. Not unusual to find sometimes in HR functions. And it's not a fault of anybody's, it's the fact that somebody's naturally gone down that route but then has only realised at some point in time that it doesn't have the expertise. And it's disappointing to find these projects start and then stopped because no expertise has been used, which of course wouldn't be the case in finance.
Do you think that the current recessionary climate is a factor that's going to push more people into evaluating HR's performance?
We'd like to think, at least in terms of the HR, as we've always said about the budget being this classic trade-off between org performance and investment. And the fact that now that possibly budgets are coming under severe pressure in certain cases, that the organisation and HR along with it has to really think through about what it's trying to do, because I still see a lot of initiatives going on in organisations, and therefore still then raises the question exactly what bang for your buck are you getting? Is the answer that people obviously still need to look at.
And from what you're saying, it's as equally valuable for a public sector organisation as a private sector organisation.
Yes, some possibly would argue that it's actually even more so, given the investment that goes on, and particularly when you think of a place like NHS. But overall, I'd say it's probably equal, that any organisation that really wants to do people management well has really got to do measurement and evaluation well.
And it's no greater problem to find the kind of outcomes that you need to measure in the public sector compared with the private?
No, in some of the models that are used, you sometimes see there's a multiplicity of outcomes that you have to take into account, and NHS being again a particular point, as indeed some of the council work that we did a couple of years back. But having said that, some of the private sector companies are quite complex in their setup, and therefore requires the required thinking through, and that's a key point.
Finally, can I ask you whether you feel that the development of human capital management depends on this ability to measure and evaluate? Are we going to see any real progress in this direction without that kind of discipline being developed?
My answer would be, I think it would be difficult to move human capital management on from where it is without the evaluation measurement. It's almost the ethos in which we are based on. The 90s saw a move towards, and early 2000s, into things like employee engagement, talent management now becoming mainstream. But I think there's a point now at which you kind of go, as an organisation, we understand this, but what are we doing different with this? How is it more effective tomorrow? Without measurement and evaluation, and as I said with the Lord Kelvin quote, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And I think it's a very useful quote to use in any context around people management.